Hello there. My name is Ian, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So the big news that's kind of rocking the music world in the past week is the passing of two absolute legends, namely Sly Stone, and of course the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson. Now, I'm a big Sly Stone fan. I mean, at least I'm a big fan of the two albums. There's a Riot Going On as well as Stand. Those are terrific albums. However, I feel like I would be remiss to deny the enormous influence that Brian Wilson has had on me. And I've talked to some of my other like prog friends and other YouTube friends and stuff. And the common thing that I'm finding is that a lot of people are saying, of course, Brian Wilson is a genius, or was a genius, but the music is not for me. And I totally understand that. And I think that that's actually going to be a theme going forward in this discussion, which, both of these records that he tried to make in the late 60s, Pet Sounds, which of course was he was successful in making and is a legendary album for good reason. And then the Smile album, which was Brian's teenage symphony to God, whatever that means. But I feel that a lot of the tension that kept the Smile album from being released was the name The Beach Boys. And I think that that is still something that prevents a lot of people from getting into this beautiful music. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into it and why I appreciate the Beach Boys music so much. And I'd also like to talk about the canon here. So the canon being these two CDs, Pet Sounds was this 1966, and the recreation of, well, actually, this version is the recreation, the Brian Wilson band version of Smile. But we'll also talk a little bit, I think, about the original Smile, which didn't come out until actually after the recreation. I do have Smiley Smile on hand. I'm not as familiar with this one. I'm still kind of getting into it. But so I went to college for music production, as well as public relations, which is, I guess, part of what I'm doing here. I'm still kind of practicing those two interdisciplinary ideas. So I was offered to take as an elective a rock appreciation course. And so I did. And obviously I was a fan of Pink Floyd. I was a fan of Jethro Tull, Rush, all of these older kind of bands. But I wasn't really aware of a lot of the wider context or even some of the more popular bands of the day. Like that course was my introduction to Beatles appreciation, as well as my uncle's love of the Beatles. That was a big part of me getting into them. But one day in class, the professor said that it's time to learn about Brian Wilson. And he put on In My Room. Now, my mom is a Beach Boys fan, and I grew up hearing her best of, which included songs like Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, Fun, Fun, Fun. And I definitely had this kind of, I had this feeling like the Beach Boys were almost like a novelty act, like they were kind of old fashioned, and it wasn't really for me because I liked the more kind of serious progressive rock sort of thing. So anyway, the professor puts on In My Room, and I'm like, whoa, okay, this is something, really different, really deep and interesting. And then he follows it up with Wouldn't It Be Nice from the Pet Sounds album. And I just remember the build up to that snare hit. And it was like my hair was blowing back. Like I was sitting in class and like there was a wind machine on me and I was just being blown away. And then the next thing he played for us, I believe was Good Vibrations, which I had heard before, but I was beginning to appreciate it more. But the song that was, as they say, hook, line, and sinker, was Surf's Up. And that we watched, I think it was the Leonard Bernstein documentary. Just that footage of Brian playing that song solo, and not to get too emotionally involved here, but I think I could have wept hearing that, because it was so just impossibly fragilely beautiful, in a way that I hadn't really encountered before. And I just knew I had to know more about the Pet Sounds album, and of course the ill-fated but resurrected Smile album. And this is going to be this discussion, and I am going to open it up to you folks. I'm getting a bunch of comments. I am going to respond to them in just a second. But I just wanted to mention that this video discussion, this presentation, which is off the cuff, it's not scripted. We're going to leave all the mistakes in and all the ramblings, but this would not have been possible had I not purchased David Leaf's excellent new book. And I have it here. I don't have a physical copy on me. I think the iPod's over there. The iPad. But let me get the name of that book so I have the right title. David Leaf. And David Leaf's story is, of course, interesting and worthy of a book in itself. But the name of the book is Smile: The Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian Wilson. So that has formed a huge part of informed a huge part of my listening this week, as well as some of my thoughts and feelings. But I also watched Leaf's Beautiful Dreamer documentary, which I highly, highly recommend. I don't know how anyone can watch that documentary, Beautiful Dreamer, and not walk away deeply moved by it, because it is totally a success story. That there was a lot of roadblocks along the way. There was many times when that could have completely derailed and never happened. So, okay, I'm going to address the comments now, and then we're going to start talking about some great music. Let's see. Zeb says, Friends 1968 should also be up there with Smile and Pet Sounds. Yeah, I need to check that out. I will admit that I am not an expert on Brian Wilson or the Beach Boys, but coming at this from being a young producer, which I think I still count as young. I don't know, 1970s, Ian Anderson was like 32 when he was making Stormwatch, so I don't know how young I am anymore. But as a young producer, Brian Wilson is absolutely a huge influence on me, and just the joy of creating. So I definitely need to check those out. I have to admit that I hadn't even heard Brian Wilson's presentation of Smile until this week. I just picked it up actually a few months ago, and I hadn't gotten around to it because I was listening to all this prog stuff and stuff for the channel. But the day he passed away, I decided to give it a listen. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Ian LaBelle says Surf's Up and Holland are great albums as well. Mike Keneally introduced me to Holland. That is such a weird album. That's the Beach Boys in Europe making an album. So I thought that was such a strange album when I heard it, but I really need to revisit it. Let's see. The 7 albums that came out after Pet Sounds need to be reassessed. And I believe that they will be, especially when, now that Brian has passed. I think that the whole catalog is going to be evaluated. And, I've been thinking that it is time to go back and hear some of the early stuff that I dismissed as novelty, because I was probably wrong. As a young music fan, I was often full of it, and full of myself too. So brilliance doesn't just appear for 2 albums. He was brilliant throughout his entire career. So, I think that I agree with you there, Ian. I think that, the albums after, but I think that I also should spend some time with the work beforehand. Ian LaBelle, I was all over the 2004 Smile. I was blown away. Me too. And I will talk about my journey to the Brian Wilson Smile, which, again, I said, it happened this week. So I believe that outside of, hello, Shock Zone. Thanks for joining us today. It's lovely to see you. Okay, so let's talk about my journey with the Beach Boys. So I believe the first Beach Boys album that I ever picked up and bought with my own money was this one. This is the Smile Sessions. This is the one disc only version. And I was just so fascinated with this material after discovering it in college, so much so that my friend and I went out and we saw the Love and Mercy film. And, for about 10 years, that was basically my knowledge of that period. And it is a great film. I haven't revisited it since seeing it in the theater, but it is fantastic. Now, Love and Mercy is more about the making of the Pet Sounds album, but there is a little bit of Smile there near the end. But so I bought this from Wayside Music, and what this is it's the original Beach Boys recordings from 1966, 1967 of the Smile album, and they are presented unfinished. Now, the track order is based on, because the whole thing with the Smile album is that it was always kind of interactive, because a lot of that stuff was released piecemeal, as somebody said, over the course of the next 7 albums or so. And so fans were constructing their own versions of Smile. And this was, so Darian, and I'm struggling to remember his last name. Darian was Brian's musical secretary and kind of his music director in a way. And he was in 2003, he was sitting with Brian and playing back these sessions and kind of figuring out how to connect all of them. And he was the one who had the idea to join them as 3 suites, which I think as a presentation works really well. So actually, this release that I'm holding in my hand would not exist if not for this one. So the whole Smile thing is, I'm going to take a drink. The whole legend here, and I think that David Leaf's book does a great job of separating fact from legend. But the whole legend here was that, of course, Brian was attempting to compete with the Beatles. The Beach Boys were, topping the singles every couple of months with, fantastically selling and great songs. But I think that Brian could tell that there was a change in the air, that, this happy, what I called novelty music, wasn't going to last. And so he set aside to create something that was from the heart. And of course, Pet Sounds is the result of that. This was also punctuated by his, I guess what you could call one of his first emotional breakdowns, where he decided to not tour anymore. He decided that he was going to stay home and write, and Mike Love and his brothers were going to go out on tour. And so while they're out on tour, he's exploring all of these new ideas and new possibilities. And, drugs were a part of that, because it was the 60s. And everybody was looking to expand their consciousness. And I think they didn't really know what the dangers of experimentation with certain drugs would be. However, now I do think that the drug factor is something that has been a little bit overstated, because at the time of making Smile, Brian was under pressure from the record label to produce another big hit song. Now, of course, Pet Sounds came out and it did not take the world by storm, especially not America, but it was huge in England, which is kind of incredible. And all these musicians were picking it up, like Eric Clapton and Paul McCartney. Brian felt the need to grow and explore while the guys were out promoting his music, and he was feeling absolutely the pressure of the record company to produce another hit, because, of course, Good Vibrations was a huge hit for them after the relatively disappointing U.S. sales of Pet Sounds, which is mind-boggling to believe, especially considering what an absolute classic that album is now. He was under pressure to finish the album, and the way that he was putting it together were all these little sections. where he was recording just little bits of music at a time with the Wrecking Crew, of course, backing, and kind of a full string and brass situation, sometimes 2 or 3 basses in the same time. And I guess a lot like Frank Zappa's Lumpy Gravy and We're Only in It for the Money, it existed in these little modules, as he called them. So it had to be all kind of constructed and editing. And he was a perfectionist. So, it wasn't unlike him to, do like 100 takes of, one little section of a song, as, infamously Good Vibrations was put together. So there's pressure from Capitol Records, who didn't like the new material. There's pressure from the Beach Boys, who, after they come back from tour, they hear this, weird kind of avant-garde, very expression-based music. And I think also Mike Love was a little jealous of Van Dyke Parks, who was Brian's co-writer. And of course, Mike Love co-wrote a lot of the early hits with Brian Wilson, and he felt replaced, which I totally understand. And as a result, I think Mike Love is kind of treated as a villain. And one of the things I really enjoyed about David Leaf's book is that he tried to show the motivations behind what, where Mike Love was coming from, and he presents him more human, which I appreciated. So yeah, record label pressure. You got the band pressuring you. He had pressure from his father. They were about to sue the record label. And so what happened is this beautiful music, which had been accepted and promoted by people like Leonard Bernstein, Paul McCartney, Eric Clapton, and others, was shelved because Brian said to himself, well, the boys all had families, they had homes, they had cars, and they depended on Brian. He was basically their provider. And I think he felt the pressure to sacrifice the work in order to save his family. And that to me is admirable. Like, I totally see where he's coming from. Now, with the 2020 hindsight of history, I don't believe that was the right decision, because if you look at the 70s were a rather dismal and depressing time for the Beach Boys. And I think they probably hurt themselves more by not releasing Smile than if they had, because of course Brian had his mental health issues and his depression, and a horrible psychologist or something kind of pushing him out there and taking his money. So it really wasn't until the 90s and the early 2000s that he was able to get himself together. And he had to have a lot of support and a lot of love. And that is where this release comes into play. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but I have a stream of comments to get after here. So Ian LaBelle says, I won front row center tickets to the Smile tour. It was one of the best shows I've ever seen. I was sitting right in front of Brian. You were so lucky, man. That's awesome. Paul Dano did a fantastic job with playing Brian, and you're absolutely right. So did John Cusack, who was playing kind of the 80s Brian, when Melinda led better. Yes, Melinda came in and saved his life, and got him help that he needed, and not somebody who was trying to take advantage of him. So yeah, I do really like that film. As always with biopics, there's always that kind of dramatic thing that you wonder, how much of this is being, movie-fied? And I love movies, don't get me wrong. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go back and, I wanted to go and read David Leaf's new book, is because I felt like he did a good job of separating, again, like a lot of the fact from fiction of this story. Yes, the Wondermints, that was the band who would back Brian. And the amazing thing about the Wondermints is that over half of them were obsessed with the Smile album and owned many bootlegs of it, and were just, eat, sleep, breathing this material before they even entered the band. And of course, the Brian Wilson band, when they first entered that group, they were not allowed to talk about Smile. It wasn't until they started playing songs like Heroes and Villains, and Good Vibrations and Surfs Up on tour, that it started to kind of, work that out. Shock Zone says, I am going to be doing a full Beach Boys discography album listen to soon. I wanted to know which is considered the best Beach Boys album, the most underrated, and the worst. I think that without a doubt, Pet Sounds is considered to be the best Beach Boys album, and for good reason. And we'll do a little side swipe here to talk about Pet Sounds again. But I was just listening to the Dolby Atmos version on streaming. But again, like, wouldn't it be nice is just one of those great, fantastic songs. Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder is just smolderingly beautiful. Oh my God. If you don't have chills while listening to that, you might want to take the Voight Kampf test from Blade Runner and make sure you're human. I think I'm Waiting for the Day is an underrated one. Sloop John B, of course, is a classic. God Only Knows. That one just kills me every time I hear it in a good way. I know there's an answer here today. Just wasn't made for these times. Caroline No is one of my favorites. I also think Hang On to Your Ego, which was, of course, I think I know there's an answer. That was, that version with different lyrics. But I think that's one of the most underrated tracks on the album, actually. So this is definitely, I would say there's probably a consensus that this is the best Beach Boys album now, even though it's not representative of who they were prior to 1966. But this is the album that would have been contemporary to like Rubber Soul, the Beatles album. As for what's the most underrated and what's the worst, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to ask somebody who's a little bit familiar with the ins and outs. And I really wanted Jocko to join me on this because he is familiar with a lot of those other albums, but he was working today, so I had to do it solo. But if anybody wants to chime in on what is the most underrated Beach Boys album, I would actually be very interested to hear that. I think it might be Smiley Smile. But we'll see what others have to say. Ian LaBelle says, I think the most underrated was Beach Boys Party. Check out the super deluxe version. Awesome. Maybe the first unplugged album. That was the one that was like right before Pet Sounds, or it was right before Smile. Pet Sounds was their most experimental album at the time. Absolutely. Let's see. Worst, Summer in Paradise. There's not a single good song on it, and the production is horrible. Absolutely. Rubber Soul was Brian's impetus to create Pet Sounds. Yes. Yeah, that's correct. He was hearing the Beatles and he loved the Beatles, and but he was feeling like he needed to up his game to keep up with them. And I think that what was happening is you have the composer who is supporting, basically his family, his brothers and cousin, and others. But he was beginning to grow. He was beginning to outgrow them a little bit, and they were trying to pull him back. And I think that, and for good reason, they were fearful. And I understand where those guys were coming from. But the result is that this great work, which Ian LaBelle says, I'm obsessed with Smile as well. This great work didn't come out until 2006. Now, we should touch upon Smiley Smile because this is kind of the lo-fi version of some of the songs from Smile, like Heroes and Villains is here, albeit in an edited version. Vegetables is here. Good Vibrations, of course. Wind Chimes, wonderful. So this is kind of a lo-fi recording. I think it was one of the first ones he did at home, like it was a home studio situation. And when this came out, it disappointed a lot of fans. And I think the reason why it was disappointing to people is because it was not Smile. It has nothing to do with the actual quality of it. Ian LaBelle says, Smiley Smile is okay. The Beach Boys on acid. Well, really, it's the Beach Boys on marijuana, as Brian said in David Leaf's book. The acid album is probably Smile. At least it's Brian's acid album. But the thing about the drugs is, were they a symptom or were they the problem? And I wonder if he turned to drugs. I mean, I'm sure he did initially to expand his creativity. Like he said that he wrote California Girls on his first acid trip, which is mind-boggling. But I wonder how much of the excessive drug taking or drinking was a result of the incredible pressure that he was under in 1967. Um, Wanted to address this. Zeb, Ian, please, the American version of Rubber Soul. Here's the thing. There's only one version of Rubber Soul to me, and it's the one with the UK track listing. And, this is pure ignorance on my part. I will gladly embrace that. But that's the only version I've heard is the UK version. And the CD that I have is the UK track listing. And I really, really, really like it. And I don't think I'd want to hear it any other way. But you're right. The version that Brian Wilson would have heard, I guess, would have been the US version, which was a different track listing. So I think that is an important delineation to make. Let's see. Smiley Smile, of course, is the aborted Smile album. In a way, yes, although some of that material showed up later on Surf's Up in 1971. Just one song did. 2020, there is some stuff on Wild Honey. There's like one song, the Mama Says song, and I need to listen to Wild Honey. It's an extra on this version of Smiley Smile, which is nice. But I'm going to take a quick drink here. All right. I turn into a Beatle whenever they're mentioned. An actual Beatle or John, Paul, George, and Ringo Beatle. That's an important distinction to make there. So, all right. So basically, for years, I spent being, absolutely enthralled by Pet Sounds, enthralled by Smile, influenced by Smile. I used to see it very much as a cautionary tale, although I don't really see it that way anymore. I think it's a lot more complex than that. What I hadn't ever heard, and I think maybe it was because some people were kind of discouraging me from listening to it, I hadn't heard Brian's recreation of the Smile album. And again, that's just pure ignorance because I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand that this was Darian, the musical secretary and director, working directly with Brian Wilson as well as Van Dyke Parks to complete this. And I just sat down, the day he passed away, which was last Thursday or whatever it was. I sat down and listened to this for the first time, and I was absolutely blown away. Now, I do miss the Beach Boys' voices because, of course, they're fantastic and iconic. But I think that it kind of makes up for it. I also miss Brian's voice. He's obviously much weathered here. And he's not singing as high as he used to, but I think at his age, he was like 61 when he made this, and what he'd been through, the fact that he put this together at all is just incredible. Like, it's just an incredible success story, and it's so inspirational. But I sat down and listened to this as a completed item with the kind of transitional material added in and the segues being basically created, and hearing it all completed, all the arrangements done. And it has a very different feeling to me than the original Smile. The original Smile has a spookiness to it. It has a sadness to it, to me. Even on some of the happier songs, they seem to be kind of joined at the hip with sadness. And that's here when it's appropriate, but this feels joyous. This feels triumphant. This actually makes me smile. Which was, obviously the point of the title of the album was that it was supposed to be something that made us all happy to listen to. And I feel like this is a masterpiece. Like, and it is very much the same project too. Like, I don't feel like, oh, we just recreated it and recrafted it. I feel like this is absolutely the natural conclusion of this project that was started back some 30 years before this. 20 years or whatever it was. But just to hear it complete was just such a beautiful thing. And I just could not believe how great this was. Honestly, I cannot believe how great this is. And it's the zenith of the whole Smile story. Now, I did get a chance to watch a performance of Smile that was on YouTube, and I thought that was even better. And this would have been the tour that Ian saw. But But I thought that was even better than the studio version, and I think that might be my favorite version of the Smile album suites. Because if you want to talk about triumphant, like, you can see a man conquering his demons right before your very eyes, watching those live performances. And it's a really beautiful and cathartic thing. I mean, if I feel that as a fan, just looking back on it, I can only imagine what it was like at the time and what Brian was going through, because, as I said, there were many times along the way that I'm sure he could have very easily backed out of doing something like this. I don't have the DVD of this to show. I've ordered it. And I'm excited to hear it because I think there's a surround mix with it. So I think that this is music that, in any format, even in mono, it's a multi-channel immersive experience. So I'm actually really looking forward to seeing the DVD proper. But yeah, this man is an absolute legend, and he will be. And his music brings me so much joy, and I think that he will continue to do so. I think that he will continue to be the legend, and people will continue to talk about this music and his Teenage Symphony to God. So, as for you folks out there, do you have any questions? I think I've probably exhausted all I have to say, at least at this point. I mentioned this might be a shorter stream, but I didn't really listen to a whole lot of other music this week. I was starting to kind of work on something. I was going to do an appearance this week talking about the best albums of 1995. And then the news that Brian Wilson had passed away hit. And I just kind of totally tunnel vision and obsessed over Smile for the last couple of days. Ian LaBelle says the 2004 Smile was the album of the year for me. Yeah, I can only imagine. And then he says, I saw Brian on his last tour. It was very sad. They wheeled him out and put him on display. Very sad indeed. Yeah, it is. I mean, I didn't see any of those later shows. I certainly had opportunity to. He came somewhat close when he did Pet Sounds Live, but I didn't get a chance to go. And, I kind of wish that I had, just to see him, just once, because obviously he's somebody that I think about a lot. Like something that I've gotten into in the past year or two is eating healthy and vegetables. And there isn't a single day that goes by that I don't eat vegetables or pour a bunch of vegetables on my plate that I don't run the vegetables tune in my head. So that's one that I think about on the daily. And there's a great story in the book. And that does kind of lead into something else that I played this week. But there's a great story in the book that, of course, Van Dyke Parks was briefly a member of the Mothers of Invention, which I didn't know. But this was like very early on. And so Van Dyke Parks knew Frank Zappa. And they took Brian and introduced him to Frank because, of course, Frank wrote Colony Vegetable. This is a song about vegetables. They keep you regular. They're real good for you. And, Frank and Brian met one another, and that's all they could talk about was their enthusiasm for vegetables and how much they loved them. So just this image of two geniuses talking about something that they were both, very passionate about is something that I would have loved to be a fly on the wall to hear. Ian LaBelle says Brian is one of the great 20th century composers, just like Frank. And you're absolutely right. And, I do think that in a lot of the media, like the documentaries and the books that I've read, I think that Frank's presence at that time is diminished a lot. And this is going to sound like a criticism, I guess, but people oftentimes talk about Brian Wilson as if he was the only one working like that at that time. And that's certainly not the case. He was the only one working in, I guess, pop, who was like that. Although you could certainly argue that Frank Zappa made pop music. I would certainly argue that. At least that was one of the things that he made was pop music. But so, yeah, to me, they're very similar geniuses and definitely belong in the same conversation because their working methods were so similar. This whole idea of recording just little sections at a time and then figuring out how it bashes together in editing is very lumpy gravy. It's very we're only in it for the money. It's something that I think that starts on this album, with Brown Shoes Don't Make It. Brown Shoes Don't Make It is kind of the Frank Zappa version of Good Vibrations in a way, because it is like a little pocket symphony. It's a lot weirder, it's a lot darker, but it's very similar in the way it's constructed. So yeah, I think they belong in the same conversation, which is why I listened to um, Absolutely Free this week. And I do think this is one of Frank's best albums. Basically, the first slew of albums that Frank Zappa put out are all absolutely masterpieces to me, including the follow-up "We're Only In It for the Money," which I also listened to. But I may not talk about a whole lot of other music today. I feel like maybe we should keep it Beach Boys centric. I might just wrap up here, because I think I've pretty much said all I've wanted to. As I said, if any of you have anything to add, any questions to ask, Ian LaBelle says, it's kind of funny that the Beach Boys were so disrespected in their day. And I think that has everything to do with their name and the idea of selling music. And if you're called the Beach Boys, then you're expected to make a certain kind of thing. And I think that this is one way that maybe Mike Love may have had a point. Now, should Smile have been released as a Brian Wilson solo album in '67? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Certainly there's a little bit of contradiction, because I was just reading that Mike Love attempted to sue Brian Wilson for the making of this album, because he felt that they should have been involved. So it's like, which way is it? But whatever. I honestly think that even though this was decades late, I think this is probably the best it could have come out. It is his great masterpiece. He says the Beatles ain't such a hot name either. You're absolutely right. There was like a joke in a Simpsons episode. Let's think of a name that's funny at first and progressively less funny every time you hear it. And and I think that's a great way to describe the name the Beatles. Yeah, Ian says Mike annoys the crap out of me. And yeah, I was talking with my mom, because my mom's a big Beach Boys fan, and she saw the Beach Boys in the mid '70s, we think. And she said that she was feeling annoyed with Mike back then, because she felt like he was trying to take the spotlight away from Brian and take control of the ship. So yeah, I always have read and assumed that he was the villain of the story. But I again, like, check out David Leaf's book, because I think that he does a good job of explaining a lot of Mike's motivations. And he may have not been the most imaginative person, because he wasn't into all this weird stuff and people making animal noises and all this stuff. Ian LaBelle says he is the villain of the story. I don't know about that. I think that there might be multiple ones. The book, David Leaf's book, says that Murray Wilson was the villain of the story, Brian's father. If you're going to point fingers, it might actually be Murray, who is to blame for a lot of the damage that happened. So yeah. So before I sign off here, and again, like, I think it's going to be an early day for me, but before I sign off here, what have you folks been listening to this week? Did you play any Sly Stone? I played Stand. And that is a great album. I also, like I said, I was playing some Frank this week. I was preparing for a video about 1995 albums for Prognaut, and I had considered sharing some of that today, but since Prognaut had something come up and he postponed, I think I might actually save my favorite albums of 1995. But I may do some sort of video on Smile at some point, depending on how well this stream does. I may do like an examination of it, but right now I'm thinking of doing a video on the top 5 multi-channel mixes of the year. Now, here's the complication. So I'm up against a deadline. I'm working on a new record for Reefer Strummus, my client in Chicago. And ironically, the cover art is inspired by Smile. And this goes back a while ago, but the name of the album is Maury's Rock Boutique. And I had this idea of the smile type store on the front cover. And to my surprise, Derek and the band really liked it. So I think we're going with that. But we got to get some mixes together in the next couple of weeks. So that's probably what I'm going to be spending the rest of my day doing, is trying to figure out how much work needs to be done. But yeah, David Jackson from Vandergraaf Generator is going to be on that. Rick Witkowski from Crack the Sky. Lynx from the band Old Blood is going to be singing on it, if you know that band. Ian LaBelle says, I love the Big Smile box set. So good. I was looking around for that. I mean, I probably spend too much money on music as it is, so I don't know if I need to snatch that up, but I'd be curious to know more about that. I'm guessing that there's some music that was left on the cutting room floor, because I'm thinking that Brian probably produced enough music for 2 albums back then. So it would be interesting to hear some of that stuff that was left off. There are some offcuts on this, such as the stereo mix of Heroes and Villains. And there's a solo version of Surf's Up that I think is actually from the Wild Honey sessions, if I read my history correct. Ian says it breaks the whole album down. So yeah, that probably is essential for me at some point. I have been reading, like on the Hoffman boards and stuff, that there's going to be a new box set coming out. So maybe I might want to hold on, not to my ego, but to my money, and see what comes out, because there's been some rumor that there might be like a Pet Sounds and Smile era thing coming, and that would definitely be right up my alley. All right, folks, it's been a lot of fun. Yes, Ian, there is a new box coming, and there's not a whole lot of information about that yet. I suggest giving a look at the Steve Hoffman site for more information about that. I believe the reason for the new box is that they have found some new material. And I don't know, there's some stuff that's been discovered. So that is of course of interest to me. And obviously there is a Atmos mix of Pet Sounds, and it's on streaming. I was just checking it out. It's Giles Martin, who, if you followed me for a little bit, I'm not the biggest Giles Martin fan, at least not of his work. But the Pet Sounds Atmos mix is okay. It's not too bad. Of course it's on streaming, which to me, streaming kind of does something to, especially Atmos mixes, that makes it sound not like music. And that's a really hard thing to explain, intangible thing to explain, but there's something kind of off about it. So I would like it if they did do a box set, and if they included some unheard material to maybe release that Atmos mix of Pet Sounds on Blu-ray, so we can hear it uncompressed. And it would be nice also to mix some of the Smile sessions in Atmos, if those elements exist, those multi-tracks exist. I think that would be really nice. Ian LaBelle says, I'm just 2-channel. And, that's fine, man. Like that's what this material was conceived for mono. Famously, Brian couldn't hear out of his right ear anyway. So he was thinking in mono. So, there's probably some truth to the mono mixes being the best and canonical ones anyway. It's just that my attraction to multi-channel is that it brings out a lot of those details. It converts your environment into an album, and you can hear things very 3-dimensional. And like when I was listening to the Pet Sounds Atmos mix, I was hearing a lot of the vocals spread out around the room, which I was really, really appreciating. So yeah, I'm looking forward actually to the idea of a 66, 67 era Beach Boys box set. And I would probably be interested in picking that up and reviewing it. Should it be of interest to me? I'll have to see an announcement. Ian says, I do like mono versions from those albums that were originally supposed to be mono. And I understand where you're coming from. However, I am probably going to break your heart and say that I prefer the stereo versions, at least of Pet Sounds, with Smile, the only version available is in mono, and that's fine. That's the one that I've heard for the last 10 years or so. But I actually prefer hearing Pet Sounds in stereo. Sorry about that, but I guess it's just the millennial in me. But all right, guys, this has been super fun. I'm going to sign off for the day. Hopefully I'll have some content this week, like I said, the top 5 multi-channel albums. I would also like to review Roxy Music's Avalon at some point, the new mix of that. And then, geez, we're just a month away from Still Living in the Past. Ian LaBelle says, Ian, get familiar with Surf's Up in Holland. Yeah, I need to hear those more. Holland was recommended to me again by Mike Keneally. And oddly enough, I actually hear a lot of Mike Keneally on the Smile album. Like that almost sounds like a blueprint for early Mike Keneally. And I know he's a major Brian Wilson fan. It would be nice to talk with him about that at some point. And don't worry about clogging up the chat. I guess we don't really have a lot of interaction this week. So actually I don't mind the back and forth at all. But I think it's time for me to get to work. It is a work day here. It's been a real pleasure talking to you folks about this album these albums that I've loved for years. It's sad that Brian has passed. But he has left a legacy of music that really makes me happy, and it brings a smile to my face, if you'll pardon the pun. Yeah, you'll hear from me real soon. Thanks again for joining me. If you missed any of this will be on the archive, and catch you later. All right. Bye-bye.